Walk yourself. That is what happens when you marry a nobody. My father laughed as he sat down in the back row with my mother to watch me do it. I gripped my bouquet of white roses and started down the aisle alone. Halfway down, the doors behind me swung open. 30 strangers in matching gray suits walked in and lined both sides of the aisle. One of them stopped, looked straight at my father and said, "Sir, you are sitting in the seat of our boss." I am Kiara, 33 years old. Until my wedding day, I was considered the failure of a family obsessed with society status. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Please like and subscribe if you have ever faced family members who underestimated your worth and tried to humiliate you. You will want to hear how my supposedly broke husband delivered the ultimate payback. Growing up in Atlanta, my life was dictated by social expectations. My father Reginald built his identity around his fraternity legacy and real estate firm. To him, you were only considered valuable if you had an elite pedigree. My mother Vivian was equally obsessed, measuring our worth by country club memberships. My older brother Marcus was their golden child, a man with zero business skills who carried the family name and married a white woman named Sarah, who desperately used her proximity to black wealth to act superior. I refused to play their exhausting games. I built a successful career as an independent supply chain consultant, bought my condo, and fell in love with Julian. Julian was quiet, brilliant, and preferred spending his weekends exploring antique shops and thrifted vintage clothes. He told my family he was a history researcher specializing in old properties. To my status-obsessed parents, he was a loser. To me, he was everything. That brings us to my wedding day at a historic Charleston estate. I planned an intimate ceremony, paying for every detail myself, because my parents absolutely refused to contribute to a union they deemed an embarrassment. I stood in the grand foyer in a custom white gown, listening to the string quartet play the bridal chorus. My heart pounded as I waited for my father to meet me at the threshold. It is a moment every daughter dreams about, her father proudly walking her down the aisle. Instead, as the heavy oak doors parted, I saw Reginald and Vivian standing near the entrance, arms crossed, their faces twisted in identical expressions of disdain. "Are you ready, Dad?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to remain composed. Reginald scoffed loudly, ensuring the guests in the back rows could hear him. "Walk yourself. That is what happens when you marry a nobody, Kiara. You think I am going to parade you down the aisle and embarrass my legacy by handing you over to a broke history nerd? Never." He turned his back on me, grabbed my mother by the elbow, and deliberately walked to the very last row. They sat down, treating my wedding like a pathetic circus act. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the back half of the room. I felt the hot sting of tears threatening to spill, but I refused to let them see me break. I tightened my grip on my bouquet, lifted my chin, and took my first step down the aisle alone. As I walked, the silence was broken by a loud whisper coming from the third row. It was Sarah, my sister-in-law, leaning conspicuously toward Marcus. "She is so brave for paying for this cheap do-it-yourself wedding," Sarah sneered. "Look at the folding chairs, and her husband could not even afford a tailored suit. It is just sad. I am glad we had a real wedding." Marcus chuckled, wrapping his arm around Sarah. "What do you expect?" he replied loudly. "She always wanted to be the rebellious charity case. Let her enjoy her little peasant party." Every step felt like walking through thick mud. The pitying stares from my extended family burned my skin. They were all complicit, allowing my parents and brother to humiliate me on the happiest day of my life. I kept my eyes fixed on Julian at the altar. He looked handsome, but his jaw was clenched tight, his eyes blazing with a quiet, dangerous intensity as he watched them mock me. I was exactly halfway down the aisle when the atmosphere in the room suddenly shifted. The wooden doors at the back of the chapel burst open with a resounding crash that echoed through the high ceilings. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing. The murmurs and cruel whispers died instantly. I stopped in my tracks and looked over my shoulder. Marching through the entrance were 30 men and women dressed in impeccably tailored gray suits. They moved with the precision of high-level corporate operatives. Without saying a word, they filed down the edges of the room, lining both sides of the aisle like a wall of absolute authority, blocking my toxic relatives from my view. The air grew thick with tension. The lead executive, A tall black man with silver hair and a cold expression did not walk toward the altar. Instead, he marched straight to the back row where my father sat. Reginald looked up, his arrogant smirk faltering as the imposing man towered over him. "What is the meaning of this?" my father demanded, trying to sound authoritative but failing miserably. "Who are you people? You are interrupting a private event." The executive looked down at my father with absolute contempt. He adjusted his suit jacket, his voice dropping to a chilling, icy register that sent shivers down my spine. "Sir," the executive said, "you are sitting in the seat of our boss. You need to vacate it immediately, or we will remove you." Reginald stood so fast his chair scraped loudly against the floor. The audacity of someone challenging him in public made his neck veins bulge. He pointed a trembling finger at the executive, his voice echoing across the silent chapel. "Do you have any idea who you are talking to?" my father demanded, his face turning red. "I am Reginald Vance. I built a real estate empire from the ground up. I am a legacy member of the most elite fraternity in this state. I am a VIP guest at my daughter's wedding, and you work for whoever she hired to pull this pathetic stunt." My mother Vivian stood beside him, clutching her pearl necklace. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, glaring at me down the aisle. "Kiara, tell your rented security team to back off. You are embarrassing us. We know you scraped together your pennies to rent this venue for a few hours. Stop pretending you have any actual power here." Marcus leaned over from the next row, laughing. "Yeah, Kiara. Did you hire these guys off the internet to make your cheap wedding look important? Dad is right. Call off your actors before the police are called. We all know you and your broke fiancé cannot afford real security." Sarah, my sister-in-law, chimed in with her condescending tone. "It is just so tacky, Kiara. We are trying our best to be supportive of your budget wedding, but you are making it very difficult for us to pretend this is normal." I stood frozen in the middle of the aisle, my heart hammering against my ribs. I had no idea what was happening. I looked at the executive, expecting him to apologize, but his expression remained cold. He did not blink at the insults thrown his way by my family. Instead, he reached into his tailored gray jacket and pulled out a leather-bound folio. "There are no actors here, sir," the executive said, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "And there seems to be a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of this property. Miss Kiara did not rent this historic estate with pennies. This venue is no longer available for public rental or commercial use." Reginald scoffed, crossing his arms over his chest. "What are you talking about? Of course it is a rental property. I know the commercial real estate market in Charleston better than anyone. This property belongs to a corporate holding company." It belonged to a holding company until exactly 2 o'clock yesterday afternoon. The executive corrected, calmly, stepping one pace closer to my father. "The entire estate, including the surrounding 50 acres of land, the main house and this chapel, was purchased in a private all-cash transaction. It is now a strictly privately owned residential estate. And as I stated previously, you are currently occupying the exact seat specifically reserved for the sole owner of this property." Vivian scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Well, whoever the owner is, I am sure they would be incredibly honored to have a man of my husband's social status sitting in their chair for an hour." "I can assure you, madam, he is not honored in the slightest," the executive replied, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "He is waiting for his bride." The executive slowly raised his hand and pointed directly toward the altar. A collective gasp rippled through the hundreds of wedding guests. My mother abruptly stopped breathing. My father's mocking smirk vanished instantly. Marcus dropped his printed wedding program, and Sarah covered her mouth in sheer shock. Even I turned my head, my white gown swishing softly against the floorboards, completely bewildered by the sudden turn of events. Standing at the altar was Julian. But this was not the Julian my family loved to mock. This was not the quiet man who spent his weekends digging through historical archives, wearing faded vintage sweaters and scuffed boots. The man waiting for me looked like he had just stepped out of a corporate boardroom in New York City. He was wearing a flawless, bespoke black tuxedo that fit his broad shoulders with devastating perfection. His posture radiated an overwhelming power that commanded instant respect. He looked at my stunned family with cold indifference, but when his eyes finally met mine, his expression softened into a warm, reassuring smile. My mind raced to process the reality shifting in front of me. Julian, the quiet history researcher who loved tending my backyard tomato garden, was the actual owner of this multi-million-dollar estate. He had bought it entirely in cash. He was the undisputed boss of these 30 intimidating suit-clad executives lining the aisle. "This is a joke," Reginald stammered helplessly, his voice suddenly losing all of its booming confidence. He pointed a shaking, hesitant finger toward the altar. "That is simply impossible. Julian is just a broke history nerd. He drives a 10-year-old car. He spends his free time reading old books. He absolutely does not have the massive capital required to buy a property like this. You are lying to me." The executive did not raise his voice, but his words sliced through the air like a blade. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek, matte black business card featuring embossed silver lettering. He held it out steadily. Reginald snatched the card aggressively, his eyes scanning the text. The color completely drained from my father's face as his hands began to tremble, realizing the catastrophic mistake he had made. "History is merely his personal hobby, sir," the executive said, his tone entirely devoid of mercy or hesitation. "His actual day job is serving as the chief executive officer of a private equity firm that specializes entirely in liquidating bankrupt legacy corporations. He dismantles failing family businesses for a living. Speaking of which, Mr. Reginald, your manufacturing company was placed on our hostile acquisition list early this morning." The silence in the chapel was absolute. My father stared at the business card in his trembling hand, his mouth opening and closing without making a single sound. The reality of his financial ruin paralyzed him. The executive simply turned his back on my parents and gave a subtle nod to the rest of the security team. They stepped aside, clearing the path. Julian held out his hand and I walked the rest of the way down the aisle, no longer feeling the sting of rejection, but the overwhelming rush of vindication. We exchanged our vows in front of a stunned audience. The power dynamic in the room permanently shifted, but my family has never known how to bow out gracefully. The reception took place in the grand ballroom of the estate, a breathtaking space with crystal chandeliers and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor. Instead of leaving in shame, my parents and brother stayed desperate to maintain their social standing among our extended relatives. My mother, Vivian, immediately went into damage control mode. She could not handle the fact that the daughter she labeled a failure was hosting the most lavish event our family had ever seen. I watched from the head table as my mother carried her champagne glass from group to group, her face fixed in a tight, practiced smile. She leaned in close to my aunts and uncles, whispering venomous gossip loud enough for the serving staff to hear. "It is all a facade," my mother told my Aunt Patricia. "You know how these things work. A man like Julian does not just magically acquire this kind of wealth through clean business. He was wearing thrift store sweaters last week. Now he buys a multi-million-dollar estate in cash, please. He is probably involved in illegal street business. It is dirty money. I give it 6 months before the federal investigators freeze all his assets and Kiara comes crying to us for bail money." My relatives exchanged uncomfortable glances, some nodding along because it was easier than challenging Vivian Vance. She thrived on tearing me down to elevate herself. But I was done sitting quietly while she assassinated my character. I stood up, picked up my own glass, and walked directly toward the center of the ballroom where my mother was holding court. The room quieted down as they saw me approach. I did not yell. I did not cry. I smiled a bright, razor-sharp smile. "Mother," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the silent room, "I just wanted to take a moment to thank you for coming today, and I especially want to thank you for your outfit." My mother narrowed her eyes, immediately suspicious. "My outfit?" she asked, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "It is just something I pulled from my closet, Kiara." "Oh, I know," I replied cheerfully, stepping closer so everyone could hear every single word. "I recognized it immediately. It is the exact same emerald green dress you wore to Marcus and Sarah's wedding 3 years ago. I remember it vividly because you spent $10,000 on a custom beaded gown for your daughter-in-law that day, but you could not even be bothered to buy a new dress for your own biological daughter's wedding." Gasps rippled through the surrounding tables. My aunt stared at my mother's dress, suddenly realizing I was absolutely right. The physical proof of her blatant favoritism was wrapped right around her body. I did not stop there. It is actually very fitting. I continued, keeping my tone perfectly conversational. You have treated me like an afterthought my entire life. You refused to pay for my college. You refused to contribute a single dime to this wedding. You sat in the back row today and tried to humiliate my husband. But the irony is, you are standing in my house drinking my expensive champagne, trying to convince our family that my success is a crime, simply because you cannot stand the fact that I no longer need your permission to exist. My mother's face flushed a deep, humiliated red. She looked around frantically, but the relatives who usually agreed with her were now staring at their plates, too embarrassed to defend her. She opened her mouth to snap back, but her voice completely failed her. She was entirely exposed. Seeing Vivian backed into a corner, my sister-in-law decided it was her time to shine. Sarah had always viewed our family as her personal reality television show, constantly weaponizing her privilege to assert dominance. She could not stand seeing me win. She marched over to the band stage, grabbed a butter knife, and began clinking it aggressively against her crystal glass. "Excuse me," Sarah yelled into the microphone, the high-pitched feedback causing guests to wince. "Excuse me, everyone. I would like to propose a toast." Julian came to stand right beside me, his hand resting reassuringly on my lower back as we watched Sarah hijack my reception. Marcus stood near the stage, puffing his chest out, trying to look like the proud patriarch his father was failing to be. "Today is supposedly about Kiara and Julian," Sarah said, her voice dripping with condescension. "And we are all just so happy that Kiara finally found someone on her own level. It takes a lot of courage to throw together a wedding like this one today. But since we are all gathered here right now, Marcus and I wanted to share some actual good news to save this family's reputation." Sarah placed a dramatic hand over her flat stomach, pasting on a glowing theatrical smile. "Marcus and I are pregnant," she announced loudly into the microphone. "We are expecting the true heir to the family legacy, the one who will carry this noble bloodline forward into the next generation. Unlike some people in this room, we understand what it means to uphold the family name." My mother immediately leaped from her chair, clapping her hands together with exaggerated joy. She rushed toward the stage. Vivian wrapped her arms around Sarah, sobbing fake tears of happiness. My father, still looking pale and physically shaken from his earlier encounter with Julian's executive team, managed to force a stiff smile and nod from his seat. Marcus strutted across the dance floor, chest puffed out like a proud peacock. He grabbed the microphone from his wife and wrapped his free arm around her shoulders. He looked directly at Julian, a condescending smirk plastered across his face. "Thank you, everyone," Marcus boomed, his voice echoing through the grand ballroom. "Sarah and I are beyond thrilled. It takes a lot of hard work and dedication to maintain the standard of excellence my father established. But that is exactly what we do. Julian, man, you might have scraped together some cash to buy this old building, but money cannot buy you a legacy. My $2 million mansion in the exclusive hills of Buckhead, that is the real pinnacle of Black excellence. That is where the next generation of our family's elite will be raised. Not everyone is built for that kind of pressure, but we carry it well." A few of my father's business associates clapped politely, but the tension in the room was suffocating. My loyal friends and colleagues stared at my brother with absolute disgust. They knew exactly how hard I had worked to build my own consulting firm from scratch, while Marcus had been handed an executive title at my father's company, despite failing out of his first 2 years of college. Julian did not flinch. He did not say a single word. He simply reached out, gently took the microphone from Marcus's hand and passed it to me. His dark eyes locked onto mine, giving me a silent nod of absolute support. He was letting me handle my family exactly how I saw fit. I gripped the cold metal of the microphone. The ballroom went dead silent again. I looked at my brother, who was still grinning arrogantly, and then at my sister-in-law, who was resting both hands on her stomach in a picture-perfect pose of maternal superiority. "Congratulations, Sarah," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly steady. "A baby is a wonderful blessing, and Marcus, you are absolutely right. It does take a lot of hard work to maintain a standard of excellence. It takes discipline, transparency, and a solid foundation." Speaking of your $2 million mansion, Julian and I actually got you two a very special wedding gift to celebrate your beautiful elite lifestyle. Sarah's fake glowing smile faltered for a fraction of a second, quickly replaced by a look of greedy curiosity. She loved expensive things, especially when she did not have to pay for them herself. A gift? Sarah asked into the microphone, feigning surprise. Oh, Kiara, you really did not have to do that. We know you and Julian must be so stretched thin after buying this venue today. It was no trouble at all, I replied cheerfully, gesturing toward the head table where she and Marcus had been sitting. In fact, I had my team place it right at your seat earlier today. It is the large black velvet box wrapped in a beautiful silver silk ribbon. Go ahead, Sarah. Open it up. We want you to share this incredible moment with the entire family. Sarah skipped back to her table. Marcus followed close behind her, his arrogance momentarily replaced by sheer greed. My mother hovered right behind them, eager to see what kind of lavish jewelry or expensive watch Julian and I had supposedly purchased to beg for their approval. The entire ballroom watched in breathless anticipation. The 30 men and women in tailored gray suits, Julian's elite corporate liquidation team, stood perfectly still along the perimeter of the room, their faces unreadable masks of stone. Sarah untied the silver silk ribbon with eager, trembling fingers. She flipped open the lid of the black velvet box, a triumphant, superior grin stretched wide across her face. She was fully expecting to pull out diamond earrings or a set of solid gold Rolex watches. She reached her manicured hand inside. Instead of a soft velvet cushion or a heavy jewelry case, her fingers brushed against thick, heavy cardstock. Sarah frowned, her brow furrowing in confusion. She pulled out a thick stack of densely printed legal documents bound by a heavy brass clip. The front page featured a bold red official government stamp at the very top. Her eyes scanned the first few lines of the printed document, and the smug, arrogant smile completely vanished from her face. It was replaced by a look of absolute, terrifying comprehension. Her hands began to shake so violently that the heavy stack of papers nearly slipped from her grasp. She dropped the black velvet box onto the floor, the hollow thud echoing through the quiet ballroom. "What is it, honey?" Marcus asked impatiently, leaning over her shoulder to read the printed documents. "Is it a deed to a new vacation home?" Marcus squinted at the bold, capitalized letters printed across the top of the first page. The blood drained from his face. He stumbled backward, knocking his expensive wooden chair over with a loud crash. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with sheer panic and undeniable guilt. I raised the microphone back to my lips, my voice ringing out clear and uncompromising. Since Marcus loves to brag about the pinnacle of black excellence, I thought everyone should know the truth about that $2 million mansion, I announced, making sure my father heard every single syllable loud and clear. You see, Sarah, what you are holding in your trembling hands right now is not a shiny new deed to a vacation home. It is a formal, legally binding notice of foreclosure, and you have 30 days to get right out. Sarah stared at the thick stack of papers, her breath hitching in her throat. She looked frantically from the foreclosure notice to Marcus, her eyes wide with desperate pleading confusion. She wanted him to laugh it off, to tell the entire ballroom this was just a cruel, tasteless prank. Instead, Marcus stood frozen, his jaw completely slack, looking like a man who just watched his entire world crumble. "Marcus, what is this?" Sarah shrieked, her voice cracking as she waved the documents. "Why does this piece of paper say the bank is seizing our home? Tell her she is lying right now." I kept the microphone raised, making sure my voice carried clearly over the rising murmurs of our wedding guests. "He cannot tell you I am lying, Sarah, because every word printed on that document is the absolute truth," I said, my tone sharp as shattered glass. "You love to brag about your perfect $2 million mansion and pristine legacy. But what your husband forgot to mention while shopping for country club memberships is how he actually pays for that elite lifestyle." I took a slow step forward, my eyes locked directly on my brother. "Go ahead, Marcus. Tell your pregnant wife about the second mortgage. Tell her about the massive secret loans you took out against the house to cover $400,000 in underground gambling debts." The entire ballroom erupted into chaotic gasps. My mother let out a strangled, horrified noise, clutching the edge of her table to keep from collapsing. My aunts and uncles began whispering furiously, their eyes darting between me, Marcus, and Sarah. Sarah dropped the papers onto the floor as if they had physically burned her. "Gambling debts," she shrieked, her face turning a blotchy, furious red. You took out a second mortgage without telling me we are having a baby, Marcus. Marcus finally found his voice. He pointed a shaking finger at me, his eyes bulging with rage. You have no right to look into my personal finances, Kiara. That is illegal. You and your fake millionaire husband cannot just forge bank documents to humiliate me. Nobody forged anything, Julian said. His voice did not require a microphone to command the room. It was deep, calm, and terrifyingly steady. When a debtor defaults on a loan of that magnitude, the bank categorizes it as bad debt. They package those toxic assets and sell them off to private equity firms at a steep discount to recoup their losses. My firm specializes in acquiring toxic debt. At exactly 2 o'clock this afternoon, right before I walked down that aisle, my acquisitions team purchased the note on your house. We are officially your new creditors. We do not offer extensions to men who insult my wife. Marcus let out a roar of absolute unhinged fury. The carefully constructed facade of the golden child completely shattered. He kicked his chair out of the way and lunged forward, charging directly toward the stage where Julian and I stood. He did not care that hundreds of people were watching. He only cared that his fake empire had been exposed. You are ruining the family name, Marcus screamed, his fists clenched at his sides as he marched toward me. You have always been a jealous, spiteful little brat. You are trying to destroy my life because you know Dad loves me more than you. Before Marcus could even reach the first step of the stage, two of the gray-suited executives stepped seamlessly into his path. They did not raise their hands. They simply stood shoulder to shoulder, forming an impenetrable human wall of tailored wool and cold authority. Marcus slammed to a halt, realizing instantly that taking another step would result in him being physically dismantled. I looked down at my brother, feeling absolutely no pity for the pathetic man standing before me. I am not ruining the family name, Marcus. You ruined it the moment you decided to treat Dad's company like your personal piggy bank. My father, who had been sitting in stunned silence, suddenly snapped his head up. What did you just say? Reginald demanded, his voice trembling with fear and anger. I turned my attention to my father, gripping the microphone tighter. You always praised Marcus for his brilliant business skills, Dad. You gave him an executive vice president title and a massive corner office. You told everyone he was the future of your company. But did you ever actually look at the quarterly accounting reports? Did you ever wonder how Sarah could afford $50,000 diamond tennis bracelets and luxury European vacations on Marcus's base salary? Shut up, Kiara! Marcus panicked, his voice cracking as he tried to push past the executives. Do not say another word. Shut your mouth right now. He has been embezzling money from your corporate operating accounts for 5 years, Dad, I announced, ignoring my brother's frantic pleas. He created fake vendor invoices and funneled the cash directly into offshore accounts to fund Sarah's insatiable spending habits. He stole hundreds of thousands of dollars from the very company you built from the ground up, all to maintain the illusion that he is a successful man. Your golden child is a thief. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. My father's face contorted into a mask of pure, unfiltered rage. But his anger was not directed at the son who had just been exposed as a fraud. His anger was entirely directed at me. Reginald could not handle the public destruction of his carefully curated image. He shoved his way past my mother, his face purple with absolute fury. He charged toward the stage, pointing a threatening finger directly at my face. You vindictive monster, Reginald screamed. You dare attack your own brother in public to satisfy your petty jealousy. I am calling my personal lawyers right now. I am physically removing your name from the family trust today, and you will never see a single dime of my money. Reginald stood at the stage edge, heaving as he delivered his ultimate threat. He honestly believed that cutting me off from the family trust would somehow bring me to my knees. I looked down at him with an unchanged expression, letting out a sharp, genuine laugh that echoed through the quiet ballroom. The family trust? I asked, my voice dripping with absolute amusement. Dad, do you think I care about a trust fund Marcus has probably already drained to pay for his luxury cars? You can keep your money. I have not needed a single dime from you since I was 18 years old. Reginald slammed his hand against the edge of the stage, his face twisting with indignant rage. You ungrateful brat! he yelled, abandoning his polished country club persona. I gave you the life you have right now. I put clothes on your back. I put a roof over your head. I paid for your entire existence. You are a successful consultant today because of the elite education I financed. You owe me respect. I am the patriarch of this family, and I demand that you show me the gratitude I deserve. The sheer delusion in his words was staggering. He had spent years telling his wealthy friends that he fully funded his highly successful daughter, taking credit for my hard work to boost his own ego. It was time to tear down that specific lie once and for all. I did not argue. I reached into the hidden pocket of my gown and pulled out my phone. Before the wedding, my audio-visual team set up a massive projection screen behind the band to play a romantic slideshow. I tapped my screen, syncing it directly to the ballroom's main projector. You paid for my elite education, Dad, I asked, my voice calm and deliberate. Let us show all of your esteemed guests exactly how much of my life you financed. I pressed a button. The massive digital display behind the stage flickered to life. Instead of romantic wedding photos, the screen illuminated the ballroom with high-resolution images of my old college bank statements and faded pay stubs. Gasps rippled through the audience as the numbers and dates became clearly visible. Take a good look, I commanded, pointing at the screen. Those are my pay stubs from 4 years of undergraduate studies. While my father hosted lavish charity dinners and bragged about my achievements, I was working 60-hour night shifts at a greasy diner. I smelled like stale coffee every single day. I paid for my textbooks, my rent, and my tuition because my father explicitly told me business degrees were a waste of time for a woman. Reginald's face went completely pale. He took a step backward, his eyes darting around the room as his wealthy friends stared at the undeniable proof of his neglect. But that is not the best part. I continued swiping my finger across my phone screen. The projection behind me instantly changed. A new set of documents appeared. These were wire transfer receipts from my father's corporate account. The bold red numbers highlighted massive payments totaling exactly $100,000. While I served cheap burgers at 2 in the morning to pay for classes, my father made these wire transfers, I announced, slicing through the heavy tension. He secretly wired $100,000 directly to the national chapter of his elite fraternity. Why? Because his golden child Marcus had a grade point average so pathetically low, he was going to be rejected. My father bought Marcus his legacy status. He literally bribed the fraternity so his incompetent son could wear those letters. The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. Several older men in the audience, proud legacy members of that exact fraternity, stood up in absolute disgust. They glared at Reginald and Marcus, recognizing the severe violation of their brotherhood's code of honor. Marcus shrank back behind his pregnant wife, his arrogance completely obliterated. He had always bragged about earning his spot, and now everyone knew he was nothing but a fraud who needed his daddy to buy his friends. You bought a fake legacy for a son who is currently bankrupting your entire company, I said. Do not ever stand in my house and demand respect from me again. You did not build me. I built myself despite you. Reginald looked like a cornered animal. His reputation, the only thing he truly cared about in this world, was currently burning to the ground in front of his most important social circle. He opened his mouth to shout another defense, but no words came out. He was completely defeated. Seeing her husband humiliated and her son exposed, Vivian completely lost her mind. She could not accept that the daughter she treated like dirt was dismantling their entire fake empire piece by piece. Her social standing was evaporating and she desperately needed to regain control. Vivian shoved her way to the front of the crowd, her face twisted with a level of malice I had never seen before. She pointed a sharp manicured fingernail directly at Julian, her voice screeching over the murmurs of the stunned guests. You think you have won because of some fake bank documents? Vivian screamed, her entire body shaking with rage. You are nothing, Kiara, and your husband is a scam artist. I am not going to let some ghetto hedge fund tear my family apart. She reached into her designer clutch and pulled out her smartphone, holding it high. I am calling my best friend right now, Vivian shrieked. You all know exactly who she is. She is the state bank governor and she owes me a massive favor. I am going to have her freeze your dirty accounts. I will have your little ghetto hedge fund investigated, audited, and shut down before midnight. Vivian held her phone high. her manicured fingers flying across the screen as she dialed the number she claimed would end my husband. The ballroom held its collective breath. My mother always wielded her social connections like a loaded weapon. For decades, her proximity to power was the only currency she truly valued. She pressed the phone to her ear, a triumphant and malicious smile stretching across her face as the line connected. She began to speak with exaggerated sweetness, projecting her voice so every single guest could hear her elite connection. "Clarissa, darling, I am so sorry to bother you on a Saturday." Vivian purred, her eyes locked on Julian with pure venom. "But we have a severe emergency at Kiara's wedding. Yes, it is a complete disaster. Her new husband is running some illegal, unverified hedge fund, and he is trying to commit fraud against our family. I desperately need you to use your ultimate authority as governor of the state bank to freeze his bank accounts immediately. He is a dangerous scam artist." Vivian paused, listening to the voice on the other end of the line. Her triumphant smile faltered for a fraction of a second, her perfectly arched eyebrows pulling together in sudden confusion. She pulled the phone away from her ear, staring at the screen as if the device itself had betrayed her. The call had ended abruptly. "She just hung up on me," Vivian muttered, her voice completely losing its previous volume. "She must have lost the signal." "She did not lose the signal, Vivian," a commanding female voice echoed from the back of the room. The heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom swung open for the second time that evening. The murmurs of the crowd died down instantly. Walking through the entrance was Clarissa Montgomery, the state bank governor, flanked by two towering security guards. She was a striking black woman in her late 50s, wearing a sharp-tailored burgundy suit that screamed absolute authority. Her presence alone demanded immediate respect, and my mother had spent years bragging about their supposed close friendship. Vivian's face immediately lit up with desperate relief. She shoved her way past my stunned aunts and uncles, rushing toward the entrance with her arms wide open, ready to embrace the powerful woman she thought was coming to save our family's crumbling reputation. "Clarissa, thank goodness you are here," Vivian cried out, attempting to wrap her arms around the governor's shoulders. "You have to stop this madness. Kiara's husband is trying to ruin us." Clarissa Montgomery did not return the embrace. She did not even break her stride. She sidestepped my mother completely, leaving Vivian stumbling forward with her arms grabbing nothing but empty air. The collective gasp from the wedding guests was deafening. Vivian Vance, a woman who prided herself on being the queen of Atlanta's black elite, had just been publicly ignored by the most powerful woman in the room. The governor walked straight past my humiliated mother, past my terrified brother, and past my father, who was still leaning heavily against the edge of the stage. She marched directly toward the center of the ballroom where Julian and I stood. When she reached us, Clarissa stopped, adjusted her burgundy jacket, and did something that made the entire ballroom freeze in absolute shock. The state bank governor, a woman who held the financial stability of the entire region in her hands, lowered her head in a deep, respectful bow toward my husband. "Good afternoon, sir," Clarissa said, her voice filled with unmistakable reverence. "I apologize for the dramatic entrance, but this matter required my immediate personal attention." Vivian spun around, her mouth hanging open. "Clarissa, what are you doing?" my mother shrieked, completely losing whatever was left of her mind. "Why are you bowing to him? He is a nobody. He wears thrift store clothes." Clarissa finally turned her head to look at my mother, her expression dripping with professional disgust. "Vivian, you have always been a fool obsessed with shiny objects. You think power is a designer label. True power is writing the check that buys the designer label's entire parent company. You just insulted a man who controls more liquid capital than the gross domestic product of several small nations." My father, Reginald, let out a strangled noise. His wide eyes darted frantically back and forth between Julian and the governor. "What is going on here?" Reginald demanded, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "Why is the state bank governor reporting to my daughter's husband?" Clarissa turned her attention to my father, her eyes narrowing into cold slits. "I am not reporting to your daughter's husband, Reginald. I am reporting to the majority stakeholder of the Central Banking Consortium. I am reporting to the man who personally funded the development grants that kept this state's economy afloat last year." She turned back to Julian, handing him a sealed, thick leather folder stamped with a golden seal. Sir, the governor announced, projecting her voice so that every single person in the grand ballroom heard the final devastating truth. The executive board of directors convened an emergency meeting at exactly 3 o'clock this afternoon. We have extensively reviewed the massive commercial debts, the offshore embezzlement accounts, and the highly fraudulent corporate ledgers completely associated with Vance Manufacturing. I am here to personally deliver the finalized legal paperwork. The executive board just officially approved your complete hostile takeover of Reginald's entire manufacturing firm. The silence that followed those words was heavier than gravity. It pressed down on the room, suffocating the last remnants of my family's arrogance. You now successfully own 78% of all voting shares, Clarissa continued relentlessly. Vance Manufacturing, along with its subsidiaries and real estate holdings, belongs entirely to your private equity firm. The hostile transfer is legally binding and permanently finalized. My father stood totally frozen at the edge of the large stage. The realization hit him like a massive freight train crashing through a solid brick wall. His entire identity, his precious fraternity legacy, his elite country club status, his sprawling corner offices, and his entire life's work had just been brutally ripped from his hands. Everything he desperately valued now belonged exclusively to the quiet son-in-law he had just maliciously mocked and called a worthless nobody. Reginald's face quickly turned a horrifying shade of pale gray. He slowly opened his mouth to speak, to deny the undeniable truth, to scream, but absolutely no sound came out of his throat. His hands flew upward, his trembling fingers tightly gripping the expensive fabric of his custom-tailored suit jacket. He let out a sharp, terrifyingly ragged gasp for air. His eyes rolled far back in his head as he collapsed very heavily into a nearby wooden chair, aggressively clutching his chest in sheer, overwhelming, paralyzing terror. Reginald sat slumped in his chair, gasping for breath, clutching his chest as his entire reality crumbled around him. Nobody rushed to his side. The wealthy guests who had been singing his praises just moments ago now stared at him with profound disgust. They recognized a sinking ship when they saw one, and in the world of high society, failure is highly contagious. My mother Vivian stood completely frozen, staring at the state bank governor who had just orchestrated her public demise. Julian did not offer my father a single ounce of sympathy. He stepped forward, reaching out to take the microphone from my hand. His demeanor was chillingly calm, radiating the kind of effortless authority that Reginald had spent his entire life desperately trying to fake. "Reginald," Julian said, his deep voice carrying flawlessly across the dead silent ballroom, "you do not need to fake a heart attack. You need to listen very carefully to what is going to happen next. As of 3 o'clock today, my firm is the majority shareholder of Vance Manufacturing. That means I am now the boss of the company you claim as your legacy. And unlike you, I actually read the accounting ledgers." Julian signaled to one of the gray-suited executives standing near the front. The executive stepped forward and handed Julian a thick red folder. Julian flipped it open, scanning the top page before looking directly at my brother Marcus, who was currently trying to hide behind a tall floral centerpiece. "Marcus," Julian called out, his voice sharp and commanding. "Step out here. Let us talk about your brilliant business acumen." Marcus shuffled forward, looking like a terrified child rather than the arrogant vice president he pretended to be. His shoulders were slumped, his eyes darting frantically toward the exit doors, which were securely blocked by my husband's corporate liquidation team. "For the past 5 years, Reginald has praised you as the golden child of this family," Julian continued, holding the red folder high. "He gave you a corner office and a massive salary. But what you actually did was run a highly successful multi-million-dollar company straight into the ground. You completely mismanaged the supply chain logistics. You alienated 3 of the firm's biggest international clients because you were too busy taking luxury vacations to Dubai to answer their emails. And worst of all, you initiated a series of highly fraudulent accounting practices to cover up your massive gambling debts." Marcus shook his head violently, his face pale and slick with nervous sweat. "That is not true," he stammered defensively. "I was following market trends. The economy has been difficult. You cannot blame me for corporate losses." I am not blaming you for corporate losses. Julian countered, his tone turning dangerously cold. I am blaming you for outright embezzlement. My audit team found the offshore accounts, Marcus. We tracked every single fake vendor invoice you generated. You stole liquid capital from the employee pension fund to pay for your country club memberships and your wife's designer wardrobe. You left your own employees, people who have worked for your father for 2 decades, vulnerable to losing their entire retirement savings. A wave of shocked, angry murmurs washed over the wedding guests. Stealing from a pension fund was the ultimate corporate sin. Reginald groaned from his chair, finally realizing the true extent of his son's destructive incompetence. Julian snapped the red folder shut, the sound cracking like a whip. He looked Marcus directly in the eye, delivering the final devastating blow. As the new majority owner of Vance Manufacturing, my first official act is cleaning up the absolute mess you created, Julian announced firmly. Marcus, your employment is terminated immediately. You are officially stripped of your executive vice president title. We have already canceled your corporate credit cards and frozen your expense accounts. The luxury company vehicle you drove here today will be repossessed by my team before this reception is over. You do not work for Vance Manufacturing anymore. You are entirely unemployed. Marcus staggered backward, his mouth hanging open in sheer disbelief. He looked at our father for help, but Reginald just stared at the floor, completely broken. The golden child had finally been stripped of his unearned crown. He had absolutely nothing left. No job, no title, no stolen money, and very soon no house. Seeing her husband utterly destroyed, Sarah realized her elite, wealthy lifestyle was officially over. She could no longer play the role of the rich, superior housewife. The reality of impending poverty hit her like a physical blow. Her entire demeanor changed in a split second. Sarah pushed past Marcus, shoving him out of the way, as if he were a complete stranger. She ran toward the edge of the stage, her face contorting into a mask of pure, exaggerated panic. She burst into violent, weaponized white tears, crying loudly and hysterically to draw the attention of every single guest in the ballroom. She wanted everyone to see her as the ultimate innocent victim. She dropped heavily to her knees right in front of where I stood. She clasped her hands together in a desperate begging motion, looking up at me with wide, tear-filled eyes. This was her ultimate defense mechanism. When her arrogance failed, she always resorted to playing the helpless victim to escape any real accountability for her terrible actions. "Kiara, please," Sarah wailed, her voice cracking with manufactured desperation. "You have to stop him. You cannot let Julian do this to us. I am an ally. You know I am an ally. I fought so incredibly hard to be accepted into this black family. I embraced your culture. I stood by your brother. I have been nothing but highly supportive of you from the very beginning." She reached out, trying to grab the hem of my custom white wedding dress, but I took a swift step back, looking down at her with absolute disgust. "You cannot do this to me," Sarah sobbed uncontrollably, placing both of her hands dramatically over her flat stomach. "I am carrying your brother's child. I am carrying the next generation of this family. You are a woman, Kiara. You have a heart. You cannot possibly put a pregnant woman on the street." I stared down at Sarah, kneeling on the pristine ballroom floor. Her mascara ran in dark tracks down her pale cheeks, her hands desperately clutching her stomach in a calculated display of maternal vulnerability. For years, she weaponized her tears to escape accountability, relying on everyone to soothe her manufactured distress. Marcus had always fallen for it. My parents always fell for it. But I was entirely immune to her performance. I took a deliberate step backward, ensuring the hem of my white dress remained out of her reach. I looked at her with a cold stare, feeling absolutely no sympathy for the woman who spent the last 3 years trying to diminish my existence. "Get up off the floor, Sarah," I commanded, my voice projecting clearly through the microphone so every guest could hear her humiliation. "Your weaponized tears do not work on me. You are not a victim here, and you are certainly not an ally." Sarah let out a dramatic, shuddering sob, burying her face in her hands. "How can you say that, Kiara? I love this family. I have always respected your culture." "You have never respected my culture," I fired back, my tone razor sharp. "You simply fetishized our money. You loved the idea of marrying into a wealthy black family because it gave you an edgy, progressive aesthetic for your social media profiles. But behind closed doors, you were exactly who you have always been." The silence in the room was absolute. My aunts, uncles, and colleagues watched in stunned fascination as I exposed the hidden reality of my brother's marriage. Do you really want to talk about how supportive you have been? I asked, pacing slowly across the stage. Let us talk about last Thanksgiving. Do you remember when I decided to wear my natural hair in braids for the first time at a family dinner? You pulled me aside in the kitchen, leaned in close, and told me it looked a little too unprofessional for a corporate consultant. You suggested I straighten it so I would not intimidate my white clients. A collective gasp rippled through the tables where my black colleagues sat. They recognized that insidious brand of passive-aggressive racism instantly. Sarah's sobbing hitched her eyes, darting around the room as she realized her carefully crafted progressive image was being publicly dismantled. Let us talk about how you behaved at my firm's charity gala 6 months ago. I continued relentlessly, making sure the microphone caught every syllable. You deliberately mispronounced the names of 3 of my senior black partners all evening long. When I corrected you, you giggled and said ethnic names were just so hard to remember. You did it on purpose to assert dominance, to remind them that no matter how successful they were, you still held the ultimate privilege of disrespecting them without consequence. Sarah covered her face, shaking her head in frantic denial, but she did not dare speak into the microphone to defend herself. She knew I had witnesses sitting right in the front row. Marcus stood a few feet away, paralyzed, watching his wife be exposed as a fraud. He ignored her subtle racism for years, because her blonde hair and blue eyes were the ultimate status symbols he desired to parade at his elite events. You did not fight to be accepted into this family, Sarah, I said, delivering the final crushing blow. You used your proximity to black wealth as a convenient aesthetic. You used my parents' desperate need for white validation to secure your place at the top of their twisted hierarchy. You demanded to be treated like a queen, while subtly stepping on the necks of the very people who welcomed you. So no, I do not care that you are pregnant. I do not care that you are crying. You can pack up your fake allyship, gather whatever designer bags Julian's liquidation team lets you keep, and take your absolute privilege to a homeless shelter. Sarah collapsed against the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. Marcus did not even try to help her up. He just stared blankly at the ground, a thoroughly defeated man who had traded his dignity for a woman who was now completely worthless to his social standing. The room felt like a pressure cooker ready to explode. The wealthy guests squirmed in their seats, horrified by the unapologetic dismantling of the Vance family empire. They had come to celebrate a wedding, and instead found themselves trapped inside a corporate and social execution. The gray-suited executives remained perfectly still, watching the dramatic fallout with cold efficiency. While Sarah wept and Marcus remained frozen, my mother finally snapped. Vivian Vance spent her entire life worshipping at the altar of social status. Her identity was entirely dependent on being the wealthiest matriarch in her social circle. In the span of 30 minutes, I had exposed her favorite son as an embezzling thief, revealed her husband as a total fraud, and publicly humiliated the white daughter-in-law she had always treated better than me. Her perfect, manicured world was completely gone. She had absolutely nothing left to lose, and that realization made her incredibly dangerous. Vivian let out a guttural, terrifying scream that sounded more like a wild animal than a human being. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. She spun around and aggressively grabbed a full open bottle of vintage red wine from the center of the nearest guest table. The dark crimson liquid sloshed violently over the glass rim, staining her bare hands. You ruined my life! Vivian shrieked, her eyes completely wild and unhinged. You ruined my family, you are a demon. She raised the heavy glass bottle high above her head like a dangerous weapon. Without a single moment of hesitation, my mother charged directly at the stage, her furious eyes locked onto my immaculate custom white silk wedding gown, fully intending to destroy the one beautiful thing I had left. Time slowed down to an agonizing crawl as my mother closed the distance between us. Her arm swung forward in a vicious, sweeping arc, sending the heavy glass bottle hurtling toward me. The dark red wine violently erupted from the open neck, an ugly crimson wave aimed directly at the pristine white silk of my custom wedding gown. I braced myself for the inevitable impact, refusing to step backward or give her the satisfaction of seeing me cower. I held my ground, my eyes locked on the chaotic, hateful expression twisting Vivian Vance's face, but the wine never reached me. Before a single drop could touch my dress, Julian moved with a sudden fluid speed that defied his normally calm demeanor. He stepped firmly in front of me, his broad shoulders completely shielding my body from my mother's attack. The entire contents of the wine bottle splashed heavily across his chest. The rich, dark liquid soaked instantly into the crisp white fabric of his dress shirt and saturated the lapels of his flawless, bespoke black tuxedo jacket. The heavy glass bottle slipped from my mother's stained hands, crashing against the polished hardwood floor and shattering into 100 jagged pieces. The sharp noise cracked through the ballroom like a gunshot. A chorus of terrified screams erupted from the surrounding tables. Wealthy guests scrambled backward, pulling their chairs away from the stage in a desperate attempt to escape the explosive violence. Aunts covered their mouths in sheer horror, completely unable to process the sight of their elite matriarch behaving like a feral street brawler. My father Reginald remained paralyzed in his seat, too devastated by his own financial ruin to even attempt to stop his wife's unhinged assault. Marcus cowered behind a floral arrangement entirely useless. Julian never flinched. He never raised his voice. He stood perfectly still, looking down at his ruined tuxedo with an expression of absolute terrifying indifference. He then slowly lifted his gaze and locked his dark eyes onto my mother. The atmosphere in the room shifted from chaotic panic to an oppressive, suffocating dread in a fraction of a second. The 30 men and women in tailored gray suits, who had been standing silently along the perimeter of the grand ballroom, reacted instantly to the physical assault on their boss. Moving in perfect, terrifying synchronization, they took one simultaneous step forward. The unified thud of 30 pairs of leather dress shoes hitting the hardwood floor sounded like a military battalion preparing for war. With a highly cinematic, deeply intimidating motion, every single executive reached their right hand inside their tailored jackets. The gesture was unmistakable. The entire ballroom went dead silent. The musicians on the stage dropped their instruments. The catering staff froze in their tracks. My mother, who was still panting heavily with her hands stained red, suddenly realized the catastrophic gravity of what she had just done. The wild, unhinged fury in her eyes evaporated instantly, replaced by a stark, primal terror. She took a trembling step backward, her expensive heels crunching over the broken green glass of the shattered wine bottle. She looked at the 30 executives surrounding her, realizing she was completely outnumbered, outclassed, and entirely at their mercy. Julian raised his right hand, giving a subtle, silent command to his team. The gray-suited executives immediately stopped their advance. They kept their hands inside their jackets, their eyes fixed unwaveringly on my mother, waiting for their next instruction. Julian turned his attention back to Vivian. He did not shout. He did not curse. His silence was infinitely more intimidating than her screaming could ever be. With slow, deliberate movements, Julian unbuttoned his soaked tuxedo jacket. He slid it off his broad shoulders, folding it neatly over his arm despite the ruined fabric. He handed the wet garment to the lead executive standing nearest to the stage. The executive took it with a slight bow, never taking his cold eyes off my mother. "Vivian," Julian began, his deep voice slicing through the absolute silence of the room. "You have spent your entire life operating under the delusion that your actions do not have consequences. You believe that your social status gives you the ultimate permission to abuse, humiliate, and now physically attack the people around you. You thought you could destroy my wife's wedding dress because you could not handle the destruction of your own fragile ego." My mother opened her mouth, but her throat was completely dry. She was shaking violently, her eyes darting nervously toward the intimidating wall of executives. "I want you to understand exactly what is happening right now." Julian continued, taking one slow step down from the stage, closing the distance between them. "You just committed a physical assault against me in a room filled with witnesses. Under normal circumstances, you would be leaving this estate in the back of a police cruiser. But that is entirely too easy for a woman like you. A brief public scandal is something you could eventually spin to gain sympathy from your elite friends. I am not going to give you that opportunity." Julian stopped just a few feet away from her, The sheer height difference made my mother look incredibly small and pathetic. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to maintain some semblance of her former arrogance, but she was completely stripped of her power. "As a man, I will not touch you," Julian said, his voice dropping to a dangerously low register that carried a terrifying weight. "I will not stoop to your level of physical violence because my wife deserves a husband who maintains his absolute composure. However, I am not just a man standing in front of you. I am officially the largest creditor your family has ever known. I own your husband's company. I own your son's debt. And now I am taking ownership of your personal consequences." My mother let out a small, pathetic whimper. "What are you talking about?" she whispered, her voice cracking with sheer panic. "You already took everything from us. What more could you possibly want?" "I want complete accountability," Julian replied smoothly. "You see, Vivian, when my acquisitions team audited Advanced Manufacturing this morning, we did not just find your son's embezzlement accounts. We also found the highly detailed records of your personal social club events. We found the massive charity galas you hosted. We tracked the donations you claimed to have made to various nonprofit organizations in Atlanta." Vivian's eyes widened in absolute horror. The color completely drained from her face. She realized exactly what he was about to say. "You have been running a highly sophisticated tax evasion scheme for over a decade," Julian announced, ensuring his voice reached the ears of every wealthy guest in the room. "You funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars through fake charitable organizations to avoid paying your federal taxes. You used corporate funds to pay for your personal luxury vacations and wrote them off as business expenses. You stole from the federal government extreme wealth." Julian turned his back on my mother, signaling that the conversation was officially over. He looked at her over his shoulder, delivering his final devastating promise. "I will not touch you, Vivian," Julian said, his voice cold and resolute. "But my audit team has already compiled every single fraudulent receipt, every fake tax return, and every hidden bank statement you possess. At exactly 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, they are sending your entire personal tax evasion file directly to the investigative division of the Internal Revenue Service." My mother dropped to her knees, shards of broken glass biting into her dress, completely paralyzed by the terror of a federal tax audit. Julian gently took my hand, leading me away from the spilled wine and the shattered remnants of my parents' fake empire. The moment we stepped back toward the center of the ballroom, the atmosphere shifted with whiplash speed. The extended family, the very same aunts and uncles who spent hours laughing at me, suddenly rushed forward like desperate vultures. They swarmed Julian and me, faces stretched into wide, terrifyingly fake smiles of admiration. "Kiara, sweetheart," Uncle Clarence said, shoving his wife out of the way. "We always knew you were destined for absolute greatness. You have always been the smartest girl in this family. Julian, my man, it is a true honor to officially welcome you. I run a logistics firm here and would love to schedule a lunch to discuss mutual synergy." Cousin Naomi pushed to the front, grabbing my arm with sudden affection. "I was just telling Sarah how incredibly tacky she was acting," Naomi lied smoothly, her eyes darting toward Julian's expensive watch. "You know I have always been in your corner, Kiara. We really need to get together for drinks this week. I am looking for a new corporate sponsor for my boutique." The hypocrisy was nauseating. For 33 years, these people treated me like an invisible outcast. They had constantly praised Marcus for his unearned titles and worshipped my mother for her country club memberships. Now that the power had abruptly changed hands, they were willing to step right over my weeping mother and unemployed brother just to secure a spot in my inner circle. They tripped over themselves, offering fake apologies. A cold, hard sense of absolute clarity washed over me. I pulled my arm out of Naomi's grasp, walked to the nearest table, picked up an abandoned microphone, and turned it on. A sharp screech of feedback cut through the desperate networking attempts, forcing the crowd back. "Do not offer me fake apologies," I said, my voice echoing off the high ceilings. "And absolutely do not ask my husband for a business meeting. None of you are my village. You are just spectators who love to watch a train wreck as long as it does not splash on your expensive shoes." The fake smiles melted away, replaced by uncomfortable defensive glares. "Aunt Patricia," I called out, pointing directly at the woman standing in the second row. She flinched, pulling her shawl tighter. Do you remember my college graduation? You spent family dinners telling everyone my supply chain degree was a cute hobby and I would end up a lonely spinster. You told Marcus he was the true pride of the bloodline. Are you proud of him right now? He is standing over there completely bankrupt. Patricia looked down, her face burning bright red as guests stepped away from her. And Aunt Beatrice, I continued, shifting my gaze to my mother's older sister. You told my mother to lock me out when I refused to lend Marcus my hard-earned savings to pay off his debt. You said a black woman's only duty was to protect the men in her family, even if they were actively destroying her. You enabled this toxic culture. Beatrice opened her mouth to argue, but Julian's gray-suited executives shifted their weight simultaneously. She smartly decided to keep her mouth entirely shut. And Cousin Naomi, I said, turning back to the woman who had just grabbed my arm. You spent the afternoon gossiping with Sarah about my folding chairs. You do not want a relationship with me. You want access to my husband's capital. But here is the reality. The Bank of Julian is permanently closed to anyone sharing my maiden name. I looked around at the shocked faces of the people who claimed to be my blood. You all love to preach about the importance of the family village, but your village is entirely fake. It is built on conditional love and financial manipulation. I am not playing your twisted game anymore. I am burning this village down to the ground today. As the family stood frozen in public humiliation, the chaotic energy shifted toward the back doors. While everyone was focused on my speech, Marcus saw what he believed was his one and only window of opportunity. My brother had just lost his luxury home, his executive title, and his offshore bank accounts. He was a desperate man, and desperate men make incredibly stupid decisions. Marcus crept slowly along the far wall, using the heavy velvet curtains to mask his movements. He sneaked directly toward the opulent gift table set up near the rear exit. The table was piled high with expensive silver boxes, thick envelopes full of cash, and lavish crystal homeware given by my father's wealthy business associates. I watched through the crowd as Marcus frantically grabbed a large box wrapped in gold foil. He tucked it under his arm, eyes darting like a common street thief. He then snatched a handful of the thick white envelopes, shoving them aggressively into his suit pockets. He thought he could secure a quick payday to fund his immediate escape from the disaster he caused. Marcus bolted for the heavy oak doors leading to the service hallway. He pushed the brass handle, stepping into the dimly lit corridor with a look of pathetic relief, but he did not make it past the threshold. Standing in the center of the service hallway, blocking the only exit, was the head caterer. She was an imposing woman wearing a crisp white apron over her uniform. She did not look surprised to see Marcus holding stolen gifts. She did not call for help. Instead, she reached out with lightning speed, grabbing Marcus firmly by the lapels of his jacket and shoved him hard against the brick wall. Marcus gasped for air as the back of his head slammed against the cold brick of the service hallway. The heavy gold-wrapped box slipped from his grip, tumbling to the floor with a loud metallic clatter. The thick white envelopes full of stolen cash spilled from his pockets, scattering across the gray tiles. He stared wide-eyed at the head caterer, completely bewildered by the sheer physical strength of the woman pinning him. "Are you crazy?" Marcus sputtered, his voice cracking with panic as he tried to pry her hands off his expensive suit lapels. "Do you have any idea who I am? I am the brother of the bride. You are just the hired help. Let me go right now, or I will make sure you are fired and blacklisted from every event planning company in Atlanta. My father is a powerful man and he will destroy your entire career for touching me." The caterer did not flinch. She simply tightened her grip, pressing her forearm against his collarbone just hard enough to make him distinctly uncomfortable. She looked down at the stolen money covering the floor, then back at my terrified brother, a sharp, knowing smirk spreading across her face. She was not intimidated by his empty threats or his pathetic attempts to wield his father's broken authority. Realizing that intimidation was not going to work on a woman who clearly possessed military-grade training, Marcus immediately switched his tactics. He resorted to the only tool he had ever successfully used to navigate his pathetic life. He tried to buy his way out. "Okay, look, let us be reasonable," Marcus whispered frantically, his eyes darting toward the ballroom doors to make sure nobody had followed him. "You make what, $20 an hour serving champagne? I have at least $50,000 in these envelopes right here. Let me walk out the back door to the valet parking lot and you can keep half of it. $25,000 tax-free right into your pocket. You can walk away from this catering gig tonight and start a whole new life. Nobody has to know you let me go. The woman let out a low, menacing laugh that echoed down the narrow corridor. She did not reach for the money. Instead, she let go of his jacket, taking a slow, deliberate step backward. Marcus let out a heavy sigh of relief, reaching down to gather the scattered envelopes, fully believing his pathetic bribe had actually worked. I do not need $25,000 of stolen cash, Marcus, the woman said, her voice dropping its polite service industry tone and adopting a razor-sharp corporate edge. And I certainly do not need a catering job. Marcus froze, his hands hovering over the envelopes. He slowly looked up, his greedy confidence shattering. The woman reached behind her neck and untied the knot of her crisp white catering apron. She pulled the apron over her head and tossed it carelessly onto the service cart nearby. Underneath the uniform, she was not wearing a standard black button-down shirt. She was wearing a flawless, custom-tailored dark navy business suit, equipped with a subtle earpiece winding down the back of her neck. My name is Agent Evelyn Carter, she announced, her dark eyes locking onto his terrified face. I am not the head caterer. I am the lead fraud investigator for your brother-in-law's private equity firm. I have been working undercover at this estate since 6 o'clock this morning, specifically assigned to monitor your every single movement. Marcus stumbled backward, his back hitting the brick wall again. He looked completely paralyzed, trapped in a nightmare he could not buy his way out of. We knew you were a desperate, cornered rat, Marcus. Evelyn continued, pacing slowly toward him. When men like you lose your access to offshore embezzlement accounts, you always resort to petty theft to fund your immediate escape. We placed that specific gold box and those thick envelopes on the gift table as bait. We wanted to see exactly how long it would take for the golden child to steal from his own sister's wedding. It took you exactly 14 minutes. You are entirely predictable. Marcus opened his mouth, but his breathing was so erratic, he could not form a coherent sentence. He realized every single action, every stolen envelope, and every frantic step he took had been meticulously anticipated, calculated, and documented by Julian's elite security team. Pick up the money, Evelyn commanded, her voice cracking like a whip. Pick up every single envelope and carry that gold box back into the main ballroom. You are going to return what you stole in front of everyone. No, please, Marcus begged, tears of absolute humiliation finally spilling down his cheeks. Do not make me go back out there. My father will kill me. Sarah is already leaving me. Please just let me leave the property. I will walk. I will not take a car. Just let me disappear into the night. You lost the privilege of walking away the moment you decided to treat your sister like garbage, Evelyn replied coldly. She grabbed him by the back of his suit collar, forcing him to his feet. Evelyn marched my sobbing, broken brother back through the heavy oak doors. The grand ballroom was still buzzing with the chaotic aftermath of my speech. Guests were whispering furiously, casting nervous glances toward Julian and me. When Evelyn shoved Marcus back into the light of the crystal chandeliers, the entire room went dead silent once again. Marcus stood in the center of the dance floor, trembling violently, clutching the stolen wedding gifts against his chest like a shield. My father, Reginald, who had just managed to pull himself upright in his chair, stared at his only son with a mixture of sheer horror and profound disgust. Evelyn ignored the staring crowd. She walked with purposeful, measured steps directly toward the stage where Reginald sat. She did not look at my mother, who was still weeping silently on the floor. She kept her eyes entirely focused on my father. Mr. Vance, Evelyn said, stopping just a few feet away from his chair. As the lead fraud investigator handling the hostile acquisition of your manufacturing firm, it is my legal duty to inform you of the full scope of your financial liabilities. Reginald wiped his sweating forehead with a trembling hand. I already know about the offshore accounts, my father rasped, his voice sounding 10 years older. I know he embezzled from the corporate operating funds. You do not need to humiliate me any further than my daughter already has. Evelyn reached into the pocket of her tailored navy jacket. She pulled out a small encrypted silver flash drive and held it up under the bright ballroom lights. You misunderstand the depth of his betrayal, sir, Evelyn stated, her voice projecting with ruthless clarity. Marcus did not just steal from your company's operating funds. He knew that the corporate accounts were drying up. He needed more liquid cash to cover his gambling debts before the loan sharks came collecting. Evelyn took one final step forward and dropped the silver flash drive directly into Reginald's shaking lap. That drive contains the complete verified video logs and digital footprint of your son's activities over the past 30 days, Evelyn announced, ensuring every single family member heard her devastating conclusion. Marcus did not just bankrupt your legacy firm. He actively forged your personal signature on multiple bank transfers. He systematically drained every single penny from your private personal retirement accounts. Reginald stared down at the small silver flash drive resting on his lap, as if it were a live grenade. The heavy silence in the grand ballroom was broken only by the ragged, wheezing sound of my father trying to draw breath. For 35 years, Reginald Vance had worshipped his own legacy. He sacrificed our relationship and poured his entire soul into building an empire he believed would stand for generations. And now, he was holding the undeniable proof that his empire had been completely gutted from the inside out by the exact son he had chosen to inherit it. Reginald slowly lifted his head. The look he gave Marcus was completely devoid of the blind adoration he had showered on his golden child for decades. It was replaced by a pure, visceral hatred. My retirement accounts. Reginald whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of devastation and rising fury. He gripped the flash drive, his knuckles turning white. You drained my personal retirement accounts, Marcus. I gave you the executive title. I handed you the keys to my kingdom, and you used them to rob me blind. Marcus took a frantic step backward, holding his hands up defensively. Dad, you do not understand. I had to do it. The loan sharks were threatening me. I was just borrowing the cash. I swear I was going to put every penny back as soon as my next investment paid off. Your next investment? Reginald roared, finally pushing himself up from his chair. You do not make investments, Marcus. You make bets. You are a degenerate gambler playing dress-up in the suits I bought for you. You are a pathetic, incompetent thief. Do not call me incompetent, Marcus yelled back, the cornered rat finally showing his teeth. You set impossible standards for me my entire life. You paraded me around your elite fraternity brothers and expected me to magically know how to run a multi-million-dollar supply chain. I failed out of college twice, Dad. You knew I was not built for corporate leadership, but you forced me into that office anyway, just so you could brag about your precious legacy. You set me up to fail, and now you want to act like the victim. I bought your legacy because you were too stupid to earn it yourself. Reginald screamed, stepping right into Marcus's personal space. I paid $100,000 to get you into my fraternity because you were an embarrassment. I hid your failures from the entire world to protect the Vance name. And this is how you repay me, by stealing the very money I was going to use to retire. You are no son of mine. You are a disgrace to the bloodline. While the two men screamed about failure and stolen wealth, Sarah stood frozen a few feet away. Her calculating blue eyes darted between Reginald and Marcus, processing the catastrophic reality of her situation. She had married Marcus specifically because he represented a lifetime of secure elite black wealth. She loved the country club memberships, the $2 million mansion, and the endless stream of designer handbags. Now she was looking at a man who had absolutely no job, no executive title, no house, and no offshore accounts. Worse than that, Marcus had stolen directly from his own father's retirement fund. He was a massive sinking ship, and Sarah had absolutely zero intention of going down with him. Sarah slowly stood up from the floor, smoothing down her expensive maternity dress. Her expression shifted from panicked victimhood to ruthless, icy calculation. Marcus! Sarah said, her voice cutting through the screaming match like a sharp knife. Marcus snapped his head toward his wife, his eyes wide with desperate hope. He thought she was going to defend him. He thought she was going to use her pregnancy to beg Reginald for mercy. Sarah, tell him, Marcus pleaded, reaching his hand out toward her. Tell Dad we needed the money for the baby. Tell him I was just trying to provide for our family. Sarah did not reach back. Instead, she looked at his outstretched hand with sheer contempt. She reached down to her left hand and gripped the massive, flawless diamond engagement ring Marcus had purchased using stolen company funds. Provide for our family, Sarah asked, her voice dripping with absolute disgust. You cannot even provide a roof over our heads, Marcus. You lied to me. You told me you were a successful executive. You told me we were part of an untouchable legacy. But you are just a broke, pathetic criminal who steals from his own father to pay off back-alley bookies. Sarah, please do not do this right now. Marcus begged, tears of profound humiliation welling in his eyes. We are having a baby. We are a team. We are absolutely nothing, Sarah fired back loudly. She yanked the heavy diamond ring off her finger. I did not spend the last 3 years dealing with your overbearing mother and your toxic family politics just to end up living in a homeless shelter. You are completely useless to me now. With a swift, violent motion, Sarah threw the diamond ring directly at Marcus. The heavy jewelry hit him square in the chest before clattering onto the hardwood floor. Do not bother coming back to the house tonight, Marcus, Sarah announced, her voice ringing clear across the ballroom. I am packing my things and I am calling my lawyer first thing in the morning. I am filing for divorce tomorrow. Marcus let out a guttural sob, dropping to his knees as his entire world completely evaporated. He reached for the discarded ring, completely broken. The sheer level of public devastation was finally too much for Vivian Vance to bear. She desperately needed to stop the absolute implosion of her family right this second. Vivian slowly stood up straight. She aggressively clutched her chest, desperately faking a massive heart attack to stop. The fighting instantly ceased as Vivian hit the hardwood floor with a heavy, dramatic thud. She let out a series of agonizing gasps, her manicured hands clawing at the fabric of her emerald green dress over her heart. She rolled onto her side, squeezing her eyes shut and contorting her face into a mask of sheer agony. Her theatrical wailing echoed across the grand ballroom, silencing the vicious argument between my father and my brother. Reginald immediately abandoned his screaming match with Marcus. He dropped to his knees beside his wife, his fury replaced by an overwhelming sheer panic. He wrapped his arms around her shaking shoulders, desperately trying to pull her upright. Vivian, look at me, Reginald shouted, his voice cracking with genuine terror. Somebody call an ambulance right now. She is having a massive heart attack. Please hold on, Vivian. Help is coming. My mother let out a ragged, breathless sob, letting her head fall back against my father's arm. She pointed a trembling, accusatory finger directly at me. You are killing me, Kiara, Vivian wailed, projecting perfectly so every guest could hear her manufactured distress. Your cruelty is stopping my heart. You destroyed your brother, you ruined your father, and now you are putting your mother in the grave. I cannot breathe. You are a murderer. A wave of shocked murmurs washed over the wealthy guests. A few aunts pulled out their cell phones, frantically dialing emergency services. Marcus used the distraction to crawl away from his discarded wedding ring. The room expected me to drop to my knees, beg for forgiveness, and surrender my power to save her life. I did not flinch. I did not drop the microphone. I stood next to Julian, looking down at the writhing woman on the floor with unwavering indifference. Nobody call an ambulance, I commanded, my voice slicing through the panic. Put your phones away. Do not waste the time of emergency services on a terrible acting performance. Reginald snapped his head up, glaring at me. Are you completely insane? My father roared, tightening his grip on my mother. Your mother is dying and you are worried about causing a scene. You are a sick monster, Kiara. If she dies today, her blood is on your hands. Her blood is perfectly fine, Dad, I replied smoothly, taking a step toward the edge of the stage. But since you are incredibly concerned about her cardiovascular health, we can handle this right now. Julian and I anticipated things might get heated today. We did not just hire 30 corporate executives for security. We also hired a private licensed medical team to remain on standby. I raised my hand and signaled toward the heavy oak doors leading to the catering kitchen. 2 uniformed emergency medical technicians stepped into the grand ballroom. They carried a bright red trauma kit and moved with practiced efficiency. They marched through the parted crowd, ignoring the frantic whispers of our extended family, and stopped beside my mother. Vivian's eyes snapped open. Her theatrical gasping halted as she stared at the 2 medical professionals towering over her. She immediately tried to swat them away. Get away from me! Vivian shrieked, her voice suddenly strong and full of oxygen. I do not want to rent a medic touching me. I need a real doctor. I need to be transported to a luxury private hospital. Reginald, make them get away. Ma'am, please remain calm, the lead medic said firmly, completely ignoring her protests. He dropped to one knee, snapped open his red kit, and pulled out a blood pressure cuff and a digital pulse oximeter. We need to check your vitals immediately. Before my mother could scramble away, the medic expertly strapped the cuff around her arm and clipped the small monitor onto her index finger. Reginald hovered nervously over them, barking empty threats about medical malpractice lawsuits if they did not treat his wife with elite care. The ballroom fell into a suffocating silence. The only sound was the soft, rhythmic hum of the digital equipment assessing my mother's supposedly failing heart. Vivian squeezed her eyes shut again, desperately trying to fake a severe medical crisis. The medic watched the digital screen for 30 seconds. He then reached up, pulled his stethoscope from his ears, and unclasped the monitor from Vivian's finger. He looked directly at me. "Well," Reginald demanded frantically, "what is wrong with her? Is it a cardiac event?" The medic stood up, packing his equipment back into his red bag with absolute calm. He turned to face the terrified wedding guests and delivered his undeniable verdict. "Her resting heart rate is a perfectly calm 72 beats per minute," the medic announced loudly. "Her blood pressure is 120/80, which is entirely optimal. Her oxygen saturation is at 100%. There is absolutely no sign of cardiac distress, no arrhythmia, and no stroke symptoms. Sir, your wife is perfectly healthy." The entire ballroom gasped in unison. Reginald slowly let go of Vivian's shoulders, his expression shifting from sheer panic to profound, humiliating realization. He stepped backward, looking down at his wife as if he did not recognize her. Vivian's face flushed a deep, furious red. The fake tears completely stopped. Her ragged breathing instantly vanished. She scrambled to her feet, brushing off her emerald green dress, refusing to make eye contact with anyone in the room. Her ultimate weapon had just been publicly destroyed. I raised the microphone back to my lips, making sure the entire family heard my final judgment. "You are a terrible actress, Mom," I said, my voice dripping with pure disgust. "You just tried to use a fake medical emergency to escape the consequences of your own actions. But this is not the first time you have pulled this pathetic stunt, is it? You have faked these exact heart episodes for 15 years every single time you lost an argument or wanted to manipulate your children into submission. I remember when I was 18 and received my college acceptance letter. You fell to the floor, clutching your chest, screaming that moving out of state would literally kill you. I gave up my dream school because I thought my ambition was causing your heart to fail. You weaponized your health to hold me hostage, and you did the exact same thing to Marcus whenever he tried to date a woman you deemed unworthy. But that era of psychological abuse ends today. You can no longer hold this family hostage with your manufactured health crises." My mother scrambled backward, her expensive emerald dress scraping against the floorboards as she tried to put distance between herself and the harsh glare of the truth. The wealthy guests who had rushed to their feet in panic just moments ago now looked down at her with unfiltered contempt. She had cried wolf for the absolute last time, exhausting the very last shred of social capital she possessed in her highly orchestrated, incredibly pathetic life. My father did not offer her his hand. He simply turned away, his own world too shattered to care about her fabricated drama. With Vivian's silence, the spotlight of absolute ruin shifted directly back to the golden child. Marcus had watched his mother's ultimate weapon fail spectacularly. He looked around the grand ballroom, realizing there was no one left to hide behind. His father's legacy was entirely gone. The prestigious manufacturing company was gone. The hidden offshore accounts were permanently gone. The elite status he parroted was gone. The only thing he had left in the entire world was the pregnant woman standing a few feet away from him, holding his discarded diamond ring in her tightly clenched fist. Marcus took a slow, trembling step towards Sarah, his eyes wide with a pathetic, desperate hope, praying she would miraculously save him. "Sarah, please listen to me," Marcus begged, his voice cracking as he reached his hands out toward his wife. "You cannot walk out that door. We are an unbreakable team. We are going to be wonderful parents to our newborn baby. I know things look incredibly bad right now, but I can fix this. I am a smart, capable man with a top-tier education. I have connections in this city. I will call my fraternity brothers. I will aggressively leverage my powerful network and find a new executive position by Monday morning. We can completely rebuild our lives." He closed the distance between them, tears of genuine panic streaming down his cheeks. "We do not need my father's company. We do not need that massive, excessively expensive house sitting on the hills in Buckhead. We can downsize for a little while until I get back on my feet. Just do not leave me, Sarah. You are my wife. You promised to stand by me through better or worse. This is just the terribly dark worst part of that sacred vow. I promise you I will work endlessly to make it completely better. I will do whatever it takes to provide for you and our baby. Sarah did not soften in the slightest. She absolutely did not reach out to comfort him or wipe the falling tears from his desperate face. She looked at her husband with an expression so cold and calculating that it made my own blood run perfectly still. She let out a suddenly sharp, loudly mocking laugh that cut through his desperate pleas. "Rebuild?" Sarah asked, her voice dripping with sheer venom. "You want me to downsize and live in some pathetic, cramped apartment while you beg your drinking buddies for an entry-level job? You maliciously lied to me, Marcus. You proudly told me you were the sole heir to a massive, incredibly wealthy real estate dynasty. You promised me a lifetime of elite country clubs, luxury vacations, and unbothered wealth. I certainly did not marry you to struggle like some ordinary average citizen. I did not spend 3 years dealing with your overbearing mother and your toxic family politics just to end up clipping coupons. You are a broke, unemployed criminal who stole from his own father. You have absolutely nothing of value left to offer me anymore." Marcus shook his head violently, refusing to accept her rejection. "You cannot just take my child and walk away from me," he shouted, his voice echoing with rising hysteria. "I have legal rights. I am the biological father of this unborn baby. I will fight you in court for joint custody. I will aggressively demand monthly spousal support from you. You cannot just abandon me here and leave me with absolutely nothing." Sarah tilted her head, a wicked, triumphant smile spreading across her pale face. "You really are incredibly stupid, Marcus. Do you truly honestly think I would leave my financial future up to a family court judge? I firmly knew you were hiding something massive from me months ago. I saw the late-night phone calls. I clearly noticed the mysteriously missing funds evaporating from our shared joint accounts. I knew the ship was sinking, and I made absolutely certain I secured my own lifeboat." She slowly reached deep into her expensive designer clutch and confidently pulled out her sleek smartphone. "Do you remember that massive stack of legal documents my father's attorney sent over last month? The ones I told you were just standard updates to my personal life insurance policies." Marcus froze, the blood draining completely from his face as he remembered the paperwork he had blindly signed without reading. "You told me it was just routine tax filing adjustments," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Exactly." Sarah sneered, her eyes gleaming with ruthless victory. "You were too busy stressing over your illegal offshore accounts to actually read the fine print. That was not a life insurance update, Marcus. That was a legally binding post-nuptial agreement. You signed away every single right you had. You agreed that in the event of a divorce resulting from your financial negligence or criminal activity, I retain sole absolute custody of our child. You also signed over complete ownership of all remaining liquid assets in our joint accounts to me while retaining 100% of your own personal debt. You legally separated our finances." Marcus let out a guttural, agonizing cry as the horrifying reality crashed down on him. His knees buckled and he dropped heavily to the ballroom floor. His arrogance had finally cost him his company, his home, his wife, and his child, leaving him completely destitute. Marcus remained on the floor, staring blankly where his wife had stood. The heavy silence in the ballroom was absolute. Guests who had spent decades kissing the ring of the Vance family now watched their utter destruction with quiet fascination. I stood on the stage looking down at the scattered remnants of the people who had dedicated their lives to making me feel insignificant. I felt absolutely no pity for them at all. I felt entirely free. I turned to the lead executive who had initiated this sequence of events at the chapel doors. "We are finished here," I announced, ensuring the microphone carried my voice to every corner of the room. "This wedding reception is exclusively for my family and my loyal friends. The people currently crying on the floor do not qualify as either. Please remove them from my property." The executive gave a sharp nod. The 30 men and women in tailored gray suits moved with terrifying precision. They formed a tight perimeter around my parents, my brother, and my sister-in-law. Sarah tried to protest, leveraging her pregnancy one last time, but two female operatives stepped directly into her path. They silently guided her toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom. She walked away without looking back, leaving Marcus weeping on the floor. Two towering men hoisted my brother to his feet, dragging his limp body away from the stage. Vivian, still sitting amidst the shattered glass and spilled wine, let out a pathetic whimper as a guard offered her a sterile gloved hand. She took it, her shoulders completely slumped, her elite country club persona entirely annihilated. As the security detail began to herd them toward the exit, Reginald suddenly snapped out of his paralyzed state. He looked at the heavy wooden doors, realizing that walking through them meant stepping into a world where he was absolutely nothing. He was a man defined entirely by his titles, his corporate bank accounts, and his perceived superiority over other black men in his elite social circles. Without those things, he was just an aging bankrupt man with a completely fractured family. "Wait!" Reginald shouted, his voice cracking with a desperate guttural panic. He violently shoved past the executive guiding him, stumbling blindly back toward the stage. "Julian, please wait. You cannot just throw me out like this." Two guards instantly moved to intercept him, reaching for his arms to physically restrain him. "Let him speak," Julian commanded softly, raising one hand to halt the security team. Reginald reached the edge of the stage. The arrogant, untouchable patriarch was completely gone. In his place was a terrified hollow shell of a man. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his face was slick with cold sweat, and his hands trembled violently. He looked up at my husband, the man he had spent the entire morning calling a broke, worthless nobody. Then Reginald Vance did the one thing I never thought I would witness in my entire lifetime. He bent his knees and dropped heavily to the ballroom floor. My father fell to his knees in front of hundreds of people, completely surrendering his pride. "Julian, I am begging you." Reginald pleaded, his voice breaking into a pathetic sob. "I will sign whatever remaining paperwork you want. I will legally transfer all my voting rights without a single fight. I will cooperate fully with your liquidation team. But please, you must let me keep a minor role in the company. Give me a symbolic advisory title. Give me a tiny office in the basement. Let me keep my corporate email address." Julian looked down at him with a mask of pure ice. "Why would I retain a man whose negligence destroyed the firm?" "Because I will die of humiliation," Reginald cried, tears finally spilling from his eyes. "My entire life is tied to that company. My fraternity brothers, the men at the country club, the board members of my charities, they all respect me because I am a chief executive. If you throw me out on the street with absolutely nothing, I will become a laughingstock. They will blackball me from every elite society in Atlanta. I will never be able to show my face in public again. I am begging you, man to man, do not strip me of my dignity. Let me pretend I stepped down voluntarily. Let me save face." It was the most honest statement my father had ever made. He did not care about the hundreds of employees who might lose their jobs. He did not care about the massive theft his son had committed. He only cared about what the wealthy men at his country club would whisper about him over their expensive cigars. He was willing to grovel on his hands and knees just to keep a fake title and an empty illusion of power. Julian stared down at the weeping man. He did not smile. He did not gloat. He simply stood there as the ultimate judge of my father's fate. But Julian did not deliver the final verdict. Instead, my husband slowly turned his head and looked directly at me. He stepped back deliberately, removing himself from the center of authority. He gestured toward my father, kneeling on the floor, effectively transferring all the power, all the leverage, and all the authority into my hands. "Hi is not my father, Kiara," Julian said, his voice echoing through the deadly silent ballroom. "This is not my legacy to dismantle or preserve. This man spent 33 years trying to convince the world that you were a failure. He made you walk down that aisle alone today. I bought the company, but you are the boss. His professional fate is entirely up to you." The entire ballroom held its breath. My father slowly lifted his tear-stained face, looking up at the daughter he had always discarded, realizing his entire future rested solely on my final command. I looked down at the man kneeling before me. Reginald Vance, the untouchable patriarch, was reduced to a trembling shell on the floor. He stared up with bloodshot eyes, searching my face for the obedience he had demanded for 33 years. He believed my ingrained sense of familial duty would override the decades of emotional abuse. He thought I would save him to preserve the illusion of our bloodline. "You want me to save your dignity, Dad?" I asked, cutting through the silence. "You want me to hand you a fake title so you can keep walking into your elite country club with your head held high? You want to sit at your fraternity dinners and pretend you are a titan of industry?" Reginald nodded frantically, tears spilling down his wrinkled cheeks. "Please, Kiara," he whispered, his voice cracking with desperation. "I am your father. You cannot completely strip me of my pride. It will kill me." "Your pride was built on lies," I replied, stepping closer. "You only cared about looking like a king. You allowed Marcus to drain your accounts because you were too arrogant to admit your golden child was a failure. You called my husband a nobody today because you were terrified my independence threatened your fragile ego. You threw me away to protect a fraud." I paused, letting the devastating truth wash over him. The wealthy guests who previously worshipped him now looked at him with unmistakable pity. "But I am not like you," I announced. "I actually believe in the value of hard work. I believe people should earn their keep. So I am going to grant your request, Reginald. I will let you keep a role in the company you built." Reginald let out a loud gasp of relief. He clasped his hands together, his shoulders dropping. "Thank you," he cried, reaching forward to grab my dress. "Thank you, Kiara. I promise I will make you proud. I will be the best senior advisor this company has ever seen." "You are not going to be a senior advisor," I corrected instantly. "You are not getting a corner office. You are not keeping your corporate email address, and you are not keeping your executive parking space." Reginald froze, his hands dropping to his sides as the brief flicker of hope was violently extinguished. "You can have a job," I said. "There is a current opening for an entry-level inventory clerk in the basement warehouse. You will be responsible for counting heavy shipping boxes and sweeping the loading dock. You will be paid exactly minimum wage with no corporate benefits. You report to work at 6 o'clock on Monday morning. If you are late, human resources will terminate you for cause." The entire ballroom collectively gasped. I was taking a man who had spent his life demanding luxury and forcing him into grueling manual labor in the dark basement of his own former empire. Reginald's ego completely shattered. He let out an agonizing wail, burying his face in his hands, as he finally understood the finality of his ruin. He was not just losing his wealth. He was being publicly stripped of his humanity and forced to start at the very bottom. I turned away from my weeping father and looked directly at the lead executive. "Get them out of my sight," I commanded firmly. The gray-suited executives moved with synchronized efficiency. Two massive guards hoisted Reginald off the floor, dragging his sobbing body backward. Another pair grabbed Vivian, who was still hyperventilating in her ruined emerald dress. She shrieked wildly, kicking her expensive heels and screaming curses as they lifted her. Marcus was hauled up by his collar, his eyes vacant as the reality of his impending divorce broke his mind. Sarah tried to run toward the back exit, but two female operatives grabbed her arms, marching the weeping woman toward the front doors alongside her disgraced husband. The security detail dragged my screaming family members straight down the center aisle. They pushed them through the grand foyer, their wails echoing off the high ceilings. The wealthy guests shrank back, giving the executives a wide berth, absolutely terrified of making eye contact with Julian or me. As the guards reached the front entrance, a blinding flash of lightning illuminated the stained glass windows. A massive clap of thunder shook the historic estate. A freezing rainstorm had suddenly swept in, turning the beautiful evening into a dark, violent tempest. The executives shoved open the grand oak doors. The freezing wind howled into the foyer, carrying sheets of heavy rain. Without a moment of hesitation, the security team threw Reginald, Vivian, Marcus, and Sarah straight out onto the wet cobblestone driveway. My mother shrieked as the freezing rain soaked her dress. Marcus collapsed onto the wet pavement, shivering violently. Sarah screamed for someone to call a car service, but her cries were drowned out by the roaring thunder. Reginald just sat on the cold cobblestones, letting the downpour wash over his tear-stained face, staring blankly at the estate he had been banished from. The lead executive stepped back inside the dry foyer. He grabbed the brass handles of the oak doors and pulled them shut. The massive doors slammed together with a loud boom that echoed like a judge's gavel across the venue. The locking mechanism clicked securely into place, sealing the toxic elements of my past outside forever. The sound of the driving rain and screaming family members was instantly muted, leaving the ballroom in a state of stunned silence. The elite guests stood perfectly still, clutching their champagne flutes, unsure of what to do or say next. I took a deep breath, feeling the heavy weight of 3 decades of psychological abuse completely lift off my shoulders. I slowly turned my back on the locked doors. I looked at Julian, who gave me a subtle, proud smile. I then turned to face the remaining guests, my true friends, loyal colleagues. The silence in the grand ballroom was fragile, hanging in the air like dust after an explosion. I looked out at the faces of my true village. These were the people who had supported my consulting firm when I had absolutely nothing. These were the colleagues who had mentored me, the friends who had wiped my tears when my family made me feel worthless, and the chosen family who saw my undeniable value long before Julian bought this estate. They were looking at me with wide eyes, waiting for permission to breathe. I let out a genuine bright laugh that shattered the tension completely. I nodded at Julian. He raised his hand and gave a sharp, decisive signal to the band waiting on the elevated stage. The musicians, who had been frozen in shock during the entire confrontation, immediately sprang to life. A deep, rhythmic bass line thumped through the massive speakers, quickly followed by the triumphant, soulful blast of a brass horn section. The band launched into a vibrant, upbeat soul track that instantly filled the massive ballroom with an undeniable, infectious energy. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere created by my toxic relatives evaporated in a single second. The room erupted into pure joy. My best friend from college let out a loud cheer, raising her champagne glass high into the air. The rest of the loyal guests immediately followed her lead. A thunderous round of applause washed over the venue, completely erasing the bitter memory of my father's cruel remarks at the chapel doors. Waiters emerged from the kitchen carrying fresh trays of hot hors d'oeuvres and sparkling cider. The gray-suited executives seamlessly blended into the background, returning to their posts along the perimeter, transforming back from an intimidating security force into discreet guardians of our peace. Julian walked across the polished hardwood floor, his ruined tuxedo jacket long gone, the white fabric of his dress shirt still deeply stained with the red wine my mother had maliciously thrown. He did not care about the dark stain. He wore it like a badge of absolute honor, a physical testament to the fact that he would always stand between me and anyone who tried to cause me harm. He extended his hand toward me, his dark eyes sparkling with a profound, unconditional love that made my heart flutter just like it did on our very first date. I placed my hand in his, feeling the solid, reassuring warmth of his grip. He gently pulled me toward the center of the dance floor. The crowd parted seamlessly, creating a wide, beautiful circle around us. The lead singer of the band grabbed the microphone, his smooth, velvety voice belting out the lyrics of our chosen song, wrapping the ballroom in a feeling of ultimate triumph. Julian wrapped his strong arms around my waist, pulling me flush against his chest. I rested my hands on his broad shoulders, letting the rhythm of the music guide our steps. We moved together with an effortless, natural grace, completely unbothered by the sheer magnitude of the toxicity we had just aggressively purged from our lives. I looked up into his handsome face, admiring the sharp line of his jaw and the gentle, reassuring smile playing on his lips. For the first time in my 33 years of existence, I felt entirely safe. I did not have to shrink myself to protect a fragile male ego. I did not have to mute my hard-earned success to make my family feel comfortable. I was dancing in a multi-million-dollar historic estate that belonged exclusively to East, surrounded only by people who actively celebrated my achievements. The contrast between the agonizing, lonely walk down the aisle and this moment of absolute, surrounded bliss was staggering. Julian spun me around, the heavy white silk of my custom wedding gown flaring out beautifully around my legs. The crowd cheered louder, their joyful voices blending perfectly with the soulful music. I threw my head back and laughed, a bright, soaring sound that came from the very bottom of my soul. I was no longer the scapegoat. I was the master of my own universe, and I was sharing it with a man who matched my ambition, my drive, and my fierce dedication to absolute authenticity. We continued to dance, completely lost in the magic of our hard-won victory. I rested my cheek against the damp wine-stained fabric of his shirt, listening to the steady, comforting beat of his heart. He rested his chin on the top of my head, swaying us gently side to side as the band transitioned into the bridge of the song. I closed my eyes, savoring the absolute perfection of this pristine moment. I thought the surprises were completely over. I thought the public dismantling of my toxic family and the revelation of his massive corporate empire were the final dramatic twists of the evening. I was fully prepared to spend the rest of the night simply drinking expensive champagne, laughing with my closest friends, and dancing until my bare feet ached. But Julian is a man who deals in long-term strategy, and he had been planning this specific day for much longer than I ever realized. Mid-dance, Julian slowly pulled away just enough to look me directly in the eyes. The playful, relaxed smile on his face shifted into an expression of deep emotional reverence. He kept his left hand firmly on my waist, keeping our bodies moving to the rhythm of the music, but he reached his right hand deep into the inner breast pocket of his stained dress shirt. He pulled out a small, incredibly delicate object and held it between us. I looked down, my brow furrowing in sudden, genuine curiosity. It was a small, antique-looking envelope made of thick, yellowed parchment paper. The edges were slightly frayed, and it was sealed with a heavy dollop of dark red wax, stamped with an old vintage crest. I stared at the heavy red wax seal, my heart suddenly beating a frantic, erratic rhythm against my ribs. The music surrounding us seemed to fade into a dull, distant hum. I looked up at Julian, searching his dark eyes for any kind of explanation. He did not say a single word. He simply offered me a gentle, reassuring nod, silently urging me to open the heavy parchment. My hands trembled as I took the small envelope from his grasp. The aged paper felt incredibly fragile beneath my fingertips, carrying the undeniable physical weight of deep history. I carefully slid my thumbnail under the vintage red wax, breaking the seal with a soft, crisp snap. I reached inside and pulled out a folded, heavily creased piece of paper. It was not a modern, digitally printed document. It was a genuine century-old property deed. The cursive handwriting was faded, written in dark brown ink that had stubbornly survived the brutal passage of time. I slowly unfolded the fragile document, my eyes scanning the dense, archaic legal jargon printed across the top. As I read the specific geographical coordinates and the deeply familiar county names, a sudden breath-stealing shock washed over my entire body. I knew exactly what these property boundaries represented. I had heard the painful whispered stories about this specific tract of land since I was a little girl sitting on my grandmother's porch. This was not just any random piece of commercial real estate. This was the exact sprawling farmland in rural Georgia where my great-grandparents had spent their entire lives breaking their backs as sharecroppers. They had worked that unforgiving soil from sunrise to sunset, bleeding and sweating for decades only to be systematically denied the fundamental right to own the very land that broke them. They died with absolutely nothing to their names, stripped of their dignity and their wealth by the oppressive systems of their era. I looked back up at Julian, my vision completely blurring with hot, sudden tears. "Julian, how did you get this?" I whispered, my voice cracking under the overwhelming, crushing weight of the historical document resting in my hands. "This land belonged to the descendants of the original white landowners. They swore they would never ever sell it to a black family." Julian stepped closer, wrapping his strong hands around my trembling wrists. His voice was incredibly soft, yet it carried a profound, world-shifting power. "They did not know they were selling it to a black family," Julian explained quietly, a fierce, protective pride burning in his eyes. "When I first met you, Kiara, you told me the heartbreaking story of your great-grandparents. You told me how they were brutally cheated out of their generational wealth. You told me how that specific trauma echoed down your family line, poisoning your father into believing that he had to worship proximity to whiteness and superficial status just to feel safe in this world. I made a silent promise to myself that very night to rewrite that narrative for you." He reached out gently, wiping a fallen tear from my cheek. "My private equity firm spent the last 3 entire years meticulously tracking down every single living descendant of those original oppressive white landowners." Julian continued, his tone shifting into the cold, calculated strategy of a corporate titan. They had fractured the estate over the decades, dividing the farmland into dozens of smaller, separate corporate holdings. My acquisitions team set up a network of blind shell companies and anonymous corporate trusts. We aggressively targeted their vulnerable assets. We systematically bought out every single one of their holdings piece by painful piece entirely in cash. We outbid them, we outmaneuvered them, and we legally forced them out of their own inherited monopolies. I stood absolutely paralyzed, clutching the fragile century-old paper against my chest. At exactly 9 o'clock yesterday morning, the final undisputed transfer of the master property deed cleared the state legal courts. Julian announced, his voice ringing with absolute undeniable triumph. The massive shell company that executed the final purchase was then instantly dissolved, and the totality of the assets were legally transferred into a single private impenetrable trust. You are looking at the finalized, unchallengeable proof. I looked down at the bottom of the aged document. Pinned neatly beneath the historic century-old paper was a crisp, modern legal addendum. It was stamped with yesterday's exact date. My eyes scanned the bold, undeniable print. The multi-million-dollar sprawling Georgia estate did not belong to a holding company. It did not belong to Julian's private equity firm. The name printed as the sole undisputed permanent owner of the massive property was Kiara Vance. A powerful, entirely consuming wave of emotion crashed over me, dropping me straight to my knees. The sheer magnitude of what my husband had accomplished was literally world-altering. For decades, my father had desperately chased the superficial, fleeting validation of country clubs and fake corporate legacies because he was deeply terrified of the poverty our ancestors had endured. My brother Marcus had stolen money to buy proximity to a privileged white aesthetic. My mother had obsessed over elite designer labels to mask the generational insecurity that ran in our blood. They had all completely lost themselves in a desperate, toxic pursuit of fake power. But Julian had bypassed all of their pathetic performative games. He had gone straight to the root of the trauma. He had legally, ruthlessly, and permanently bought back the blood, the sweat, and the stolen equity of my ancestors. I sobbed, burying my face against Julian's chest. As he dropped down to hold me on the ballroom floor, the music and the cheering guests faded completely away. I realized in that profound, deeply sacred moment that I had not just won a petty, insignificant family feud today. I had fundamentally broken a vicious generational curse. I was finally the absolute master of my ancestors' incredibly massive sacred land. Julian gently pulled me up from the polished hardwood floor, his strong hands wiping the tears of absolute triumph from my cheeks. He did not rush me to compose myself. He let me feel every single ounce of that massive world-altering revelation. The brilliant band on the stage smoothly transitioned into a slow, melodic rhythm, allowing the rest of our loyal guests to rejoin us on the dance floor. The sheer joy radiating through the grand ballroom was entirely palpable. There were no more fake smiles, no more hidden agendas, and absolutely no more toxic family members whispering vicious insults from the back rows. We spent the next several hours celebrating with the people who truly mattered. My closest friends toasted to my new business acquisitions, and Julian's elite corporate liquidation team finally relaxed their intimidating postures, enjoying the lavish catering they had covertly monitored earlier. It was a reception completely stripped of pretense, built entirely on authentic love and hard-earned respect. By midnight, the last of our wonderful guests began to slowly filter out through the grand oak doors. They hugged us tightly, offering their warmest congratulations before stepping out into the cool, refreshing aftermath of the sudden rainstorm. The aggressive thunder had completely passed, leaving behind a crisp, deeply purified night air. I stood in the massive foyer, watching the taillights of their cars disappear down the long, winding cobblestone driveway. I realized with a sudden, breathtaking clarity that I was not leaving this incredible venue. I did not have to pack my things and return to a rented condominium. This staggering historic estate sitting on 50 acres of prime Georgia land was officially my permanent home. I slowly walked through the quiet, empty corridors, my long white silk gown trailing softly behind me. Every single crystal chandelier, Every towering mahogany bookshelf and every massive window frame belonged entirely to me. I thought about my father, Reginald, who was likely sitting in a cheap motel room right now, desperately trying to comprehend how his arrogant fake legacy had been brutally dismantled in a single afternoon. I thought about my brother Marcus facing a brutal divorce and complete financial ruin because he chose greed over his own blood. I thought about my mother Vivian, whose entire social identity was permanently destroyed by her own malicious vanity. They had spent 33 years desperately trying to convince me that I was entirely worthless. They had fiercely tried to break my spirit and crush my independence. But all they had successfully done was forge me into a woman strong enough to completely annihilate them. I made my way up the sweeping grand staircase, my hand gliding over the smooth, polished wooden banister. I entered the master suite, a breathtaking, expansive room with towering glass doors leading directly out to a sprawling stone balcony. Julian was already standing out there waiting for me. He had finally changed out of his wine-stained tuxedo shirt and was wearing a comfortable, simple gray sweater that made him look just like the humble, quiet man I had fallen deeply in love with. I walked out onto the cold stone balcony, wrapping my arms around myself as the gentle midnight breeze washed over my bare shoulders. The dark, sprawling estate grounds stretched out endlessly beneath us, beautifully illuminated by the bright, glowing light of a full silver moon. I could see the thick outlines of ancient towering oak trees and the vast rolling fields of rich earth. I felt a profound, deeply spiritual connection to the very soil beneath my feet. I could almost hear the proud, triumphant whispers of my resilient ancestors echoing through the rustling leaves, thanking me for finally bringing them home. I stepped up to the ornate stone railing and leaned comfortably against Julian's side. He immediately wrapped a warm, protective arm around my waist, pulling me close. We stood in absolute silence for several long minutes, simply absorbing the sheer magnitude of our flawless victory. We had flawlessly executed the ultimate corporate and social takeover, reclaiming my history and destroying my abusers in a single devastating stroke. Every single tear I had ever shed over their cruel rejection was fully compensated by the heavy property deed now secured safely in our private vault. I rested my head against his strong shoulder, looking out at the majestic sweeping property line. A soft, genuine smile slowly spread across my face. You know, walking down that chapel aisle completely alone was not actually so bad. I joked, my voice light and teasing. But I think I definitely prefer owning the whole estate. Julian let out a low, rumbling laugh that vibrated against my cheek. He turned his body to face me, his dark eyes sparkling with that same quiet, dangerous intelligence that had utterly destroyed my father's entire existence just a few short hours ago. He gently tucked a loose strand of hair behind my ear, his touch incredibly soft and filled with unwavering devotion. "You never have to walk alone again, Kiara," Julian promised, his voice carrying the heavy, comforting weight of absolute certainty. "You are the boss now. Everyone else just lives in your world." He leaned down and pressed a long, tender kiss against my forehead, sealing the ultimate promise of our new, unbothered life together. He then turned my body slightly, pointing out toward a specific massive patch of open land resting just beyond the manicured gardens. The earth there was rich, dark, and perfectly situated to catch the brightest rays of the morning sun. "I did not buy this massive place just for the grand ballroom, Kiara," Julian whispered, his lips brushing against my temple. "I bought it because the backyard has the absolute perfect soil for your tomato garden." I let out a bright, joyful laugh, burying my face into his warm chest as tears of pure, unadulterated happiness spilled from my eyes. The beautiful, peaceful estate stood as our absolute romantic and ultimate triumphant victory.